am Femi OK, and you're in the stream. How do you envision God? Our guest on today's programme says that we are born with an inbuilt need to humanise our version of God, and our brain is actually hardwired to do so. Author, commentator and religious scholar Reza Aslan will be joining us.
I'm Malika Bilal, and I'll be bringing Reza your comments and questions. Keep those coming to me with hashtag AJStream. And of course, we're live on YouTube. There's a chat off to one side. One of our producers is moderating. Type right in there what you want to ask Reza, and I'll bring that to him. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Reza Aslan, here he is on Up Front with Mahdi Hassan in November.
What conclusions have you arrived at over your life and your career, dare I say, over whether religion is a force for good or evil, a positive or a negative?
It's both. I mean, religion is both a force of good and evil because religion is a man-made institution and human beings are both good and evil. And so I don't know why it would come as a surprise to learn that the religious institutions that we create can also be responsible for profound acts of good and compassion and positivity, and for equally profound acts of violence and bigotry and hatred.
Two very different versions of religion there. Lots to talk about. Reza Aslan joins us from the US city of Houston. Reza is on a book tour for his latest work, God, A Human History.
Also with us in this stream, Rachel Newcomb is an associate professor of anthropology at Rollins College, and Tyrone Beeson is a reporter at Pacific Northwest Magazine. Welcome to the stream, everyone. I want to start with the very first line of the book, God, A Human History. When I was a child, I thought God was a large, powerful old man who lived in the sky, a bigger, stronger version of my father, but with magical powers. Reza, those are your words. Now that you're older and perhaps a little more jaded, how has your understanding of God changed?
Well, it has changed. I mean, the God that I believe in is a dehumanized God. It's not a God with a personality or with emotions or human motivations. But I do want to say that that childhood image of God that I have is a universal image of God. It's children who have been studied by a range of psychologists and cognitive scientists about their views of God almost universally describe God in these kinds of superhuman terms, as a sort of a superhuman being with human emotions and occasionally with even human limitations.
In your human history of God, Reza, there are so many stories just packed through from the earliest times where man had some kind of sense of there was another force outside of himself, or he decided that there was, right up until current day. Out of those stories, which is the one that you really relish, enjoy telling, and tell it to us?
Well, so one of the things that I do to describe prehistoric spirituality, which of course is a very difficult topic to discuss and to dissect, is I take the Adam and Eve story in the Bible and I pretend that Adam and Eve were actually our Homo sapien ancestors. And so I take you through what their spiritual life would have looked like. Specifically in the first chapter, I walk you through their journey into one of the spectacularly painted caves that dot the landscape of Europe and Asia, but can be found as far afield as Australia and the islands of Indonesia, even here in North America, although obviously they're much newer in North America. And what I'm trying to do is explain to you that what was taking place inside of these caves was very likely a spiritual exercise, that the caves themselves were meant to be a kind of subterranean sanctuary that reflected a very well-controlled religious experience, something kind of akin to going through the Stations of the Cross. And so this is kind of my way of melding, what we know about the scientific evidence for our ancient ancestors and the biblical view of Adam and Eve as the first humans.
So we got a question here via Twitter. Lalamar says, in the book, Reza talks about the faith impulse being embedded in us as a product of our evolution, but he's also said that faith is ultimately a choice. Could he clarify that, as it seems like a contradiction?
Right. So the religious impulse, the impulse to believe that we are more than the sum of our material bodies, that there is an immaterial aspect to us, what sometimes is referred to as substance dualism, the idea that the mind and the body are separate and distinct. Yeah, that is a cognitive impulse. I think the evidence indicates that that is a function of our brains. What we do with that, of course, is a choice, whether we choose to actually continue to believe, to explore that impulse. That is a choice. And I make that statement specifically to address this conversation that we sometimes have, a useless conversation as far as I'm concerned, about whether we can prove or disprove God, or whether faith has a rational aspect to it. And the answer to both those questions is no, you can't prove or disprove God. It's a waste of time to even have that kind of conversation. And that the faith experience, the religious impulse, however you want to define it, is not a rational thing. It's an experiential thing. It is in many ways an emotion, like any other emotion. And it has everything to do with who you are as a person, your life experiences, how you relate to the world and those around you. Frankly, like any emotion that you have. So yes, it is an inborn impulse, but what we do with it is a choice. How we choose to explore it is a choice. Whether we choose to ignore it or not is a choice.
Let me bring in Rachel and Tyrone. Let's start off with Rachel. Rachel, I know you looked at a number of the faiths that Reza talked about in the book, and you had a particular question about the focus of those faiths. Go ahead.
Yes, I noticed in the book you did spend a lot of time talking about the three big monotheistic faith traditions and how the impulse to humanize God arose within those religions and how they developed as a result. But what about some of the other faith traditions that don't seem to need a deity at their center, let alone an anthropomorphic one?
Yeah. So the last third of the book, the last 3 chapters, do deal with the monotheistic faiths, primarily because the very idea of monotheism is such a new phenomenon. I mean, in the hundreds of thousands of years that you can say with some measure of confidence that we can see evidence of religious expression, the idea of one God is barely 2,500 years old. And by the way, that doesn't mean that it didn't arise occasionally. It did. It just was repeatedly rejected, sometimes violently so, precisely because of what I'm talking about with regard to this humanizing impulse. Human beings are more than comfortable with the existence of contradictory, conflicting emotions and characteristics within themselves. They are not so comfortable with that in a single God. It just made more sense to the ancient mind to have a God for each one of our attributes, each one of our emotions. And so that's what I wanted to explore and why I focused the last third of the book on those 3 religions. However, I do talk about Taoism and particularly Buddhism. It's important to understand that the idea that Buddhism is a non-theistic religion is a misunderstanding of what Buddhism is. Certainly in the Theravada branch of Buddhism, there is no conception of a deity in the way that we would understand it in the West, but in the much, much larger Mahayana Buddhism, not only is there a very clear sense of an idea of divine beings or supernatural beings, but those supernatural beings are always, without exception, understood in humanistic terms. Indeed, much of the sort of theological underpinning of Mahayana Buddhism understands the Buddha himself as essentially pure Dharma in human form. So how we think about the divine, that's not the issue. Or how many gods there are, that's not the issue. The issue is that we have a compulsion to use ourselves as the lens to understand the world, and that includes the divine. And so we just simply project our own natures, our own personalities, even our own bodies upon the gods.
Let me show you this review from the Seattle Times. Reza Aslan's intriguing book explores questions about God. Tyrone, you wrote this review. If you had had Reza to hand at the time, what would you have wanted to ask him? And go ahead and do it now.
You know, when I saw that the title of the book actually and the human history, I started to think immediately of my own experience. I don't practice any religion now, but I grew up in the South of the United States in Kentucky, and I remember the deeply humanized version of God that I got in Sunday school and with the booming voice of the Baptist preacher. God is almost like a friend in a way, not just your savior, not just this spirit that you go to, but someone who comes down to you into the pews, and so I started to have all these memories. And when the first line of God being this old guy in the sky, I mean, I completely understood. Can you talk about how God becomes meaningful in a very personal and intimate way with people? Because it's such a part of religious tradition where I come from. Do you know God? Have you met God? And that idea that it's a person who you have to come to know, almost like a next door neighbor, and maybe trace that back to God's origins, if you will.
Yeah, that's really, really great question. In many ways, the thesis of the book is that if you could look at the entire history of human spirituality as one long, interconnected, and remarkably cohesive attempt to make sense of the divine by giving the divine human emotions, human personalities, human strengths and weaknesses, human virtues and vices, until, of course, in the person of Jesus Christ, God literally becomes a human being. And I truly believe, I mentioned this in the book, I truly believe that part of the reason why Christianity is the largest, most successful religion in the history of the world, and very likely will continue to be for quite some time, is that it gives, it fully abandons itself to this unconscious impulse to humanize God. Christianity says God is not human-like, God is literally a human being. If you want to know what God is like, then just imagine the most perfect human, perfectly kind, perfectly compassionate, perfectly loving. That's God. That is a very easy thing for people to do, regardless of what culture they are from. I mean, this idea that this utterly inexpressible, ineffable, mysterious thing can be known so easily simply by imagining him as a person is an enormously appealing theological idea. It was appealing to me. That's partly why I became a Christian in high school for a few years. Precisely, I think, for that reason. I almost refer to it as it feels like scratching a cognitive itch that we all have. And you can understand why people are drawn to it. Your story is hilarious. My story is something like that. When I became an evangelical Christian when I was 15 years old, my youth pastor gave me a card, like a baseball card with Jesus's image on it. And on the back, it said, "Jesus in my pocket." And he told me, just keep it in your pocket. And this way, Jesus, who's your best friend, somebody who you can talk to, like somebody you would meet out on the streets, will always just be with you. And you can see why people would be drawn to that idea. I personally believe that it's a limiting way of thinking about the divine, which is why I ultimately left Christianity and try to create a much more expansive conception of the divine. But I completely recognize why it works so well.
Particularly if your best friend is telling you to do good. But if not, this is a comment via Facebook. This is Paul Legend, and he doesn't agree with that concept. He says, the more human beings try to compare God to a human being, the more confused they actually become. No one can know or understand God. So that's one person's perspective. But I want to move over here to this comment we just got live on YouTube. Abdullah asks, how does the human portrayal of God impact our daily lives? And Reza, you mentioned that we often project our own image, but what's the worst case scenario of that actually happening?
The worst case scenario is happening right now in Alabama, where you have evangelical pastors essentially ignoring or excusing pedophilia and child molestation because they believe, as one gentleman recently said, that it's better to have a child molester than a Democrat. That person is talking about his faith in God as just a construction of himself. We don't just give our emotions and attributes to God. We give our politics to God. We give our biases and our bigotries to God. And when we do so, we create an enormously dangerous situation where we create a God who looks and acts and thinks and feels just like we do, but without any of our human limitations. And no wonder then religion can be, as I said at the top of the show, a force for both good and for evil.
You wrote an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times, The Dangerous Cult of Donald Trump, using cult in a pejorative sense. Do you want to unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yes, I do mean cult in a pejorative sense, as its sort of connotation, as a insulated group of individuals in thrall to a charismatic leader who takes upon himself some measure of divine or prophetic authority. And that is unquestionably how a large swath of white evangelicals understand Donald Trump. I mean, you're talking about someone like Franklin Graham, who before the election positively compared Donald Trump to Abraham and Moses and David. Frank Amedia, an Ohio pastor, one of Trump's main evangelical supporters, who not too long ago said that he believes Trump is receiving divine downloads from God. People like Robert Jeffers, currently his chief evangelical advisor, who openly, explicitly said that in a political contest between Donald Trump and, quote, a candidate who expresses Christ's values, he would choose Donald Trump. And by the way, it's not just a cult. It's a doomsday cult. It's a cult that is currently facing what any objective observer would recognize to be the slow deterioration of the Trump presidency. And that's very dangerous because I've hung out with a lot of cult members, and I can tell you that cults don't deal well with reality. That the only thing more dangerous than a cult leader is a cult leader facing martyrdom. And we're starting to hear that already from his followers. Pat Robertson, just like 3-4 weeks ago, warned that anyone who disobeys Trump is disobeying God.
So speaking of Trump and, of course, the news of the day, this is a tweet. We've got several like this asking for your opinion on this. Mohammed says, what are the global implications for Trump's declaration of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? But before you answer that, another person sent us this on Twitter. Simple says, quoting you in an interview with Mother Jones, Obama has been the single worst president in modern American history in dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So my question to him, after Trump's statement today, is Obama still the worst president ever in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, I don't think Obama did anything to actually promote the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. On the contrary, I think he continued long-standing policies in the American diplomatic and foreign policy circles to essentially give the Israelis a blank check to do whatever it is that they want to. It is important to understand that our chief negotiating principle with regard to that conflict is that it should only be settled through negotiations between both parties. And whatever you think about what Donald Trump has done, you have to understand that that is ludicrous. That is pretending that both sides are on equal footing. As I like to say, you can't have a negotiation over how to share a pizza when one side is eating the pizza. So I am not a believer in the idea that negotiations will settle peace, but certainly throwing a bomb into the mix, which is precisely what Donald Trump has done, despite warnings from our greatest allies, despite warnings from his own national security advisor, despite warnings from Secretary Mattis, his own Secretary of Defense. But he's done so precisely to appeal to one group, and that is the group that I was just referring to a few minutes ago, which is his white evangelical base who views the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not as a conflict over land or politics or territory, but as some sort of cosmic battle for the end times.
Rachel and Tyrone, I just want to get your thoughts. We described Reza as an author, a commentator, a scholar. I want to play you a clip of him talking to the Speaker of the House in the United States, Paul Ryan. But I just wanted to get a sense of how do you see him and the way he uses his platform before I play this clip. Rachel?
Well, I think of Reza as a great public intellectual. I think people who have the education and the knowledge to write well for the public about subjects that the public might not know a lot about. It's a wonderful thing to be doing in the media and in his books.
Tyrone?
I agree. I think that it's important to bring scholarship into the public square and to be a good storyteller. Obviously, Reza has been involved in a number of heated discussions about his work and about his perspectives, but I think that kind of discourse involving religion, involving spirituality as a political tool and force is really important.
Let me play you this clip then. I think you might want to think of this as maybe a little bit of activism, and I'm really curious about this, Reza. Have a look.
I'm old enough now that I pretty much only judge people based on their relationship with their kids, and you seem to have a beautiful relationship with your kids. You have a wonderful family. And so I feel like I can maybe reason with you. When the big top is on fire, you don't complain to the clown, you complain to the manager. You're the manager, and the big top is on fire.
Reza, is part of what you do about calling people out? Do you feel that because you have this background in decades and decades of looking at faiths, looking at religion, looking at how people can be better people, that you also have this ability to say, listen, I'm using my name to call this out, to call you out?
I think that it's not just a responsibility. I mean, it's a duty. I got a lot of both positive and negative comments about how I had my show on CNN canceled because of my criticisms of Donald Trump. And people ask me all the time whether I regret it. I mean, I certainly regret losing what I thought was a great show. I regret the fact that dozens of people lost their jobs as a result of it. But I think that history is looking down at us at this moment, that every single one of us is going to be judged by how we respond to what is nothing short of an existential crisis in this country. You know, we in the United States do a pretty good job of rallying together when we are attacked by enemies abroad. We have an enemy within right now that is systematically dismantling not just our democratic norms, but the very values upon which this country was founded. And if you have a voice and you are not using it to shout at the top of your lungs, then you deserve the judgment of history.
So Reza, with that said, I know there are people that want to hear more just like that, your opinions. This is US Blues on Twitter who says, my question to Reza is, does he have a new show in the works?
I'm not allowed to talk about it, but yes, I'm working on something. So just give me a beat.
I have heard you say that this is the last book, God, a Human History, that you're going to write about religion. Why?
Well, two reasons. One, because I think in many ways it's a culmination of the previous works. I mean, I really feel like this is pretty much all I have to say. My other works were much more about religion, religious history, religious movements, religious characters, and this is much more about faith. It's a much more personal book. It's an appeal more than anything else to people, whether you're a believer or not, to think differently about God, to think differently about faith. And, you know, I feel as though that there are other platforms in order to spread this message to a much larger audience. I think of myself first and foremost as a storyteller, and I want to tell different kinds of stories now.
We look forward to hearing those different kind of stories. Tyrone, we're going to have to take it online because we're like 30 seconds left on this show. I've got enough time, though, to say, Tyrone and Rachel and Reza, thank you very much for being part of this show. Malika, what do you have?
I'll end with this from Nunu, who says, to me, faith is the state of the heart, the soul. As such, these symbols and language are just a means of human beings to learn about their faith and express themselves. And we all need a home at the end of the day, and so doing so, our hearts and souls, language is just a worldly aspect of that.
Thank you very much to all of our guests and our community, of course, Malika.
Definitely. Thanks for being with us on Twitter, Periscope, and on YouTube. See you next time.